What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a card discussion on a brand new Quickplay Spell that I could not be more excited for being released in Flames of Destruction, the set following Extreme Force, and that card is Designator From The Grave. Now this card is absolutely insane, and basically there's been an outcry for a card like this, but before we get into that, let's go ahead and read what this card does. So Designator From The Grave is a Quickplay spell that reads as follows. Target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, banish it, and if you do, monsters with the same name as that banished monster have their effects negated until the end of the next turn. So, if you haven't already put 2 and 2 together, this card stops hand traps. And let me go ahead and explain. So one of the most common instances, especially in this current meta, is if you have a Spiral Double Helix currently on the field. Your opponent would use the effect of Spiral Double Helix as Chain Link 1. Then you would proceed to drop Ash Blossom to negate that double helix as Chain Link 2. Well, now your opponent's going to be able to use a card like Designator From The Grave as Chain Link 3 to negate the effect of Ash Blossom. Since a hand trap like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring has to be discarded for cost, it's already in the graveyard, so this card can target the Ash Blossom considering it's already in the graveyard. The chain will resolve backwards, Designator From The Grave will banish the Ash Blossom and negate the effect of Ash Blossom until the end of the next turn. Ash Blossom is negated as Chain Link 2, and finally Spiral Double Helix will resolve. So that right there is an absolutely incredible interaction. I think the most comparable card that you can really, put side by side with this card is Psyframe Gear Gamma, because you have to think, why did Psyframe Gear Gamma really enter the original metagame? Well, the reason for that was because Droll and Lockbird saw a huge rise in popularity once players saw that Spiral was very vulnerable to the card, and it was basically like an end your turn button since the deck was so reliant on searching. Well, a lot of players saw this and basically decided to start playing Psyframe Gear Gamma because if they got Droll Unlocked on either the Terraforming or the activation of Spiral Resort, then they would just drop Droll and Lockbird, the Spiral player would drop Gamma, not only would the Droll and Lockbird be negated, but now the Spiral player would have a free Psyframe Lord Omega to go into off of that Gamma and pretty much be in a winning position outright from there, because typically if you get Gamma, it's basically just game over. So this is a very comparable card in comparison to Gamma, but there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages between these two cards, and I think that's what definitely warrants discussing here. One of the biggest weaknesses of Psyframe Gear Gamma is that you can't control any monsters in order for it to work. So when looking at any matchup, but we're going to take specifically the Spiral matchup here, as soon as your Spiral player would summon a monster, they became immediately susceptible to a Droll and Lockbird successfully resolving. They became susceptible to Ghost Reaper, Ash Blossom, basically every hand trap in the game they became susceptible to once they committed a monster to the board, which is why you saw in Spiral Mirror matches, basically it was a game of chicken as to who would summon a monster first because they didn't want to get hit by Ghost Reaper because there really wasn't a way to effectively counter that card. So now, with Designator From The Grave, this changes the dynamic of the game entirely because with Gamma, you were really only to use Gamma on something like Ash Blossom or even Droll and Lockbird if there was no monsters on the field. So like I said earlier, on a Terraforming, on a Spiral Resort, anything that would prompt those hand traps to be activated without having to commit a monster to the board. But Designator From The Grave doesn't give a shit if you have monsters on the board, which means you can now effectively counter any hand trap that discards itself to the graveyard as cost. And basically that's all of them. I mean, that's Ash Blossom, that's Ghost Reaper, that's Ghost Ogre, that's Droll Unlock. I mean, basically any hand trap outside of Psyframe Gamma, ironically, Designator From The Grave is going to be able to stop. Another downside of Psyframe Gear Gamma is the fact that you have to run Psyframe Driver in your deck as an engine requirement for Gamma to work. And that kind of, every one in every 10 games or so, you might see that Psyframe Driver pop up in your hand, and it would just be the absolute worst feeling in the world because even though Gamma was still technically live, if you drew it, it was just a dead card that wasn't doing anything outside of facilitating your Gamma from properly resolving. Designator From The Grave doesn't require you to run an engine requirement like that, and again, so basically when you look at this, it's just a better instance of Psyframe Gamma all around. But Gamma does have one advantage, and this is actually very important. Gamma is a hand trap where this is a quick play spell. So if you're going second, Psyframe Gear Gamma is still better because you can't use this card going second, and if it's in your opening hand, it might as well just be any other card because it's not going to stop your opponent's plays, whereas Psyframe Gear Gamma can still be used going second. So basically, I see Designator From The Grave acting as a replacement for Psyframe Gear Gamma if you're going first. So essentially, depending on if you're building your deck for going first or going second, is going to dictate which of these cards you're going to want to use. Because if you're going first, you're going to want to use Designator From The Grave because it's a proactive way to stop your opponent from hand trapping you, and you can proceed on with your plays from there. But if you're planning on building a deck that's going second, say for instance like going second Spiral at the current moment, Gamma is arguably a little bit better because you want to have a hand trap that's going to do something to stop your opponent who is going to be going first. Otherwise, it's not going to matter because they're going to establish their board, and if you have Designator From The Grave, it's not going to do anything. So definitely keep that in mind, and I think this is going to be an interchangeable side deck component in when it comes to players that want to run Gamma or Designator From The Grave, depending on how they build their deck. When they go first, they're going to side this card in, but when they go second, they might opt back for Gamma. Who knows, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. I want to talk about some other applications though, because even though Gamma, in comparison was a huge application, there's some other cool little tricks you can do with this card as well. If you use this card to banish an opponent's Spiral Super Agent, for instance, because Spiral Double Helix does have the name of Super Agent while it's on the field, you can technically negate Double Helix by banishing your opponent's Spiral Super Agent. So that's a cool little neat trick, and in addition to that, you're also banishing the Super Agent, meaning they're not able to shuffle it back into their deck with Spiral Resort, and that's going to force them, in the instance of a Drone Agent combo, they're going to have to shuffle the Drone back, which is very disadvantageous, meaning they can't resurrect the Drone or really do anything with that. So it's going to put them in a little bit of an awkward position. So I think that's a cute little thing you can do. But you have to realize this card can also play around chain blocking rather well. One of the big instances of effect negation with cards like Ash Blossom or Solemn Strike is the fact that they have to be used directly in response to the activation of a particular effect. Well, some players, and especially more skilled players, will know to shield the better effect if they have two effects activating in the same chain and they get to build the chain to their liking. They're going to put the good effect as Chain Link 1 so that it won't get hit by something like Solemn Strike or Ash Blossom, and they'll have the lesser of the two effects set as Chain Link 2. Designator From The Grave doesn't give a fuck where in the chain that the card is going to resolve, because when you activate Designator From The Grave at the end of the chain, if you target the card that's going to be using its effect as Chain Link 1, Designator From The Grave will resolve first, negating the effects of the card as Chain Link 1, and then when it gets to that part of the chain, it's not going to resolve, whereas cards like Ash Blossom and Solemn Strike have to be used in response directly to that effect's activation. So I think that's a very big advantage when you think about it, because that means that your opponent won't be able to shield their cards with chain blocking and all these other different techniques, and that just makes this card all around more versatile in its application. Now, another thing is, aside from the fact that it is effect negation, which is a very big and broad aspect of it, you have to realize, at the worst, this card is just a quick play DD Crow. And you have to think, DD Crow is kind of narrow in its application because, yeah, sure, okay, you can use it to banish a card in the graveyard. But this card not only banishes a card in the graveyard, but it also acts as effect negation. So if you're in the mid game and your opponent has multiple copies of cards that they start summoning that are also in the graveyard, not only can you banish that threat, but you can also negate the ones that are face up on the field as well, or activating anywhere from that matter, because it doesn't specify that the effects have to activate on the field. So if you want to banish like a letter for ABC, or maybe you just want to banish an important combo piece, this card allows you to do that. And also keep in mind, it doesn't say anywhere on this card that it's once per turn. So if you open multiples in comparison to hand traps, you're not restricted to the fact that you can only use one of them in a given turn. So you could negate multiple effects, banish multiple cards, and that just, pretty much makes this card card, all the better. Now you can start to see why I'm super excited for a card like this, because the more you think about how just wide the net is in terms of its application, it's actually just insane. Now there are some downsides, and I do want to discuss those as well, like I typically do, and I think the biggest downside to this card is that it prevents you from using the cards that you negated during your own turn. So for instance, let's say if you're going first, if you negate the effect of an Ash Blossom that your opponent used and tried to stop your play. Well, because the card specifically specifies until the end of the next turn, if you also have a copy of Ash Blossom in your hand as well, you're not going to be able to activate Ash Blossom on your opponent's turn to prevent them from making their play. So it can be a little bit cloggy in that sense, because if that's your only hand trap and your opponent happens to have the same hand trap, it's going to put you in an awkward position, because you have to decide, is it worth negating that hand trap in order to basically deny your ability to use that hand trap during your opponent's turn, because it's kind of a one or the other type scenario. However, if you have multiple hand traps and they're not of the same name, then that's completely mitigated and you don't have to worry about it. Another thing is too, it is stopped by the new hand trap, Yashiki Warashi, which I think is actually kind of hilarious, but again, I don't expect to see that card seeing a ton of play, maybe in the side deck at the best, because this is a little bit more narrow in its application, but frankly, this card might become a meta staple depending on how the format shifts, if we're still in a format that's running a ton of hand traps like we're currently seeing now, because Gamma was the answer to some of the hand trap issues that a lot of players were facing, but Designator From The Grave solves that problem in a much more effective way, especially if you're going first, and frankly, this is going to be one of the chase cards of Flames of Destruction. I will be shocked if they do not rarity bump this card in any way, because this card is absolutely phenomenal. I could not be more excited to get my hands on this card, even though Flames of Destruction is several months away. I think it's going to definitely be an insane card for the game. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Designator From The Grave and what other applications you see might be useful for a card like this to be utilized in. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.